I had a file size limit then. Now these parts I've got them clean. They're free from the etched in fingerprints, but the black coating, that chemical blackening there, that's pretty much gone. I think they'll be okay in use, but it's less than desirable. I've got to carry on now and do these diaphragm blades. Now normally I don't like to polish diaphragm blades because they're somewhat vulnerable to damage. They have the rivets on them, which means that it's easy to catch your cleaning cloth or your cotton bud on one of the rivets and damage the blade. It's also easy to catch a cotton bud on the tip of the blade and end up folding it back, damaging the blade. So I dislike polishing diaphragm blades if I can at all help it. But these ones are so marked, they're just not going to come clean without polish. So I'm just going to have to work my way through this, and I'm using this wooden block here. I've got some holes in it, so the rivet is sitting down in a hole, and I've just got to carefully clean this blade. I'm just using some Brasso metal polish here. And this should remove those marks that we're seeing on the blades. Now diaphragm blades, marks like that, you know, they're not fatal to the function of the blade by any means, because the blades don't have to move quickly, they just have to be able to move when you change the setting. But the marks are unsightly and you can do without them. So I will do my best to clean these blades up. Once I've got them polished like this, of course, then I've got to clean them with naphtha to remove all traces of the polish. So this is a tedious process I'd rather not be doing. Right, well I'll clean that one with some naphtha now and see what it looks like. You can see the colour of the polish coming off there. Of course, it's difficult working round the pivots here to clean the blade without damaging or risking damage to the pivot. Alright, well that's the blade that I've cleaned. Now that's a nice even colour now, it's not showing any marking. This is what they start off like. They're somewhat scungy looking, to say the least. So I'm just going to have to work my way through these 5 blades, get them clean, probably give them a second cleaning with naphtha to be absolutely sure that I've got rid of all the traces of polish, and then reassemble the diaphragm. And this is what the sort of result you get when someone's flood cleaned a diaphragm. To be honest, generally speaking, when someone flood cleans the diaphragm, they flood clean the whole shutter. And flood cleaning it involves either pouring in solvent and then squirting it about, working the shutter and then flushing it out, or dabbing at stuff with cotton buds soaked in solvent. It's I do use flood cleaning sometimes for doing particular diaphragms. I'm thinking of those found in the Schneider lenses for the Retina Reflex S series. I sometimes clean those in place, but I wouldn't use alcohol to do it. I would only ever use naphtha or something of that nature, because that way you're not leaving water behind that's going to cause corrosion problems. And it's something of that nature that caused corrosion problems here. And of course the corrosion might not necessarily show up straight away. I have to keep finding a place on my wooden block where I've got a hole that I can put the rivet into, so that I'm not damaging the blade. Alright, I'll clean these up and show you when they're done. I'll start assembling this diaphragm. I'll start with the plate there. That's the retainer plate, and I'll start getting the blades in. Now the blades have cleaned up quite well, and the blade's the important part here because they're the part you can actually see when the shutter is assembled. That terrible noise is the rain coming down. Right, get this last blade in. I've got to swing these blades out to expose the hole in the plate for the pivot. Well, it's coming down heavy. Fortunately, I live on one of the hill suburbs, so I don't need to worry about flooding. This plate goes on there. And the case goes over here. There, wriggle to seat it. Flip my jig over. Put that underneath. And there are 3 fixing screws that hold the retainer plate to the case. Just do those up lightly and then test the diaphragm to see whether it moves smoothly. Well, I can see the 5 pivots are there in the fixed plate, the retainer plate. That moves smoothly. That's good. Okay, I think that'll do. So I'll just tighten those screws up. And that will be our case. the diaphragm blades, as much as you see is this piece here, you never really see that outside edge. So that should be fine, that moves nice and smoothly. The mechanism plate, well this is unusual in that it's very, very lightly lubricated here, probably with graphite powder I would say, which is what I use, but it's only been very lightly lubricated there, and there was no sign that any lubrication was put on these pivot points here where it couples to the main cam, or indeed to the detent spring which couples at that point. So I'll clean these parts down with naphtha and get that back together. That at least should be an easy task. I'll start with the lens tube. Yeah, this is unusually dull through here. I wonder whether the mechanism plate was also flood cleaned, but not with the shutter blades present. There's just too many metal surfaces here that have normally got some shine to them, not because they're polished, just because that's the finish that would have come off the tool when they were made. Yeah, this is normally chemically blackened around here, and it seems to have got, there's not much there. It's very dull. It's almost see-through. It's weird. The blade actuating ring itself, well, there's not much coming off this. So there's not much coming off, there was never much on there. And these parts like this, I clean them to get rid of any traces of old oil and grease, because the old oil and grease would have gone sticky with age, and if it hasn't gone sticky with age, it will almost certainly have gathered up any passing dust and be more of a grinding compound than a lubricant. Yes, it's just a little bit odd. That mechanism plate is cleaner than it should be, I think, is what I'd say. There's normally grease, graphite grease in various places, and there's no trace of it. And even if you're not putting graphite grease in those places yourself because you don't see the need for it or don't see it as desirable, you can usually not get traces of it completely away. So if there are no visible traces, it means that somebody did an exceptionally thorough job of cleaning it, and you've got to wonder what with. You wonder, was it a vapor phase degreaser or something, or brake cleaner or something of that nature can be a problem, because the solvents are very good at getting rid of oils and other contaminants, but they also chill down the metal to a large extent, which means then that any moisture in the air in a normal humid environment will settle. As the solvents evaporate, you're left with cold metal with no protection against moisture at all, and the moisture would settle on it. condense. Okay, so that moves nice and smoothly. I'm going to lubricate this with graphite powder, as I suspect it probably was previously. Put that to one side and then do the shutter blades. Well, I've assembled that. That's lubricated with graphite powder. Moves nice and freely. That's great. So that mechanism plate's ready to have the shutter blades put back on it and have the case fitted. But of course, I haven't dealt with these shutter blades yet. Now these are much cleaner and can't have been flood cleaned. But I'm going to polish them anyway, get them into as good a state as I possibly can. Now polishing these is much easier than polishing diaphragm blades because they're dead flat. I won't bother showing you the process. Well, I've just put my mechanism plate here into the blade's open position and fit these shutter blades. Start here. These cleaned up very well. They're much easier to deal with than the diaphragm blades. Of course, they weren't marked like the diaphragm blades. They were marked, but just not the same sort of marks. That flood cleaning, and it certainly left its scars on the diaphragm, but not the shutter. Right, so that's done. I'll put the case over the top of that now. This only goes on one way, and it goes here. Let's get the holes, make sure the holes are all lined up. That looks good. And get the 3 case screws. Put them in place. I'll just do these up very lightly, because sometimes when you're putting the case over the top of the blades, you manage to disturb the position of one of the blades so that it's no longer sitting over the pins correctly, and could then get damaged if you just clamp the case closed on it. And that all moves very nicely. I can tighten those 3 screws up. And that is the base part of the shutter done. Some people would say that was the tricky part. Those parts are all done, clean, ready to go. And the blades look really nice, and the diaphragm blades also look good. I can start putting the other stuff back together. Right, I'll start getting this shutter back together. First I've got to get these springs in place. These are always, it's a bit of a fraught business getting these fine springs in position. You need a decent pair of tweezers. I've got an exceptionally pointy pair here, and I hate the things I've just managed to stab myself while I was talking to you. But we'll see how we get on. I'll start with this one. Always hold something over the centre of that boss so that spring can't get away, while I lift the end of it up carefully with my tweezers, position it behind the other stud, and And now this lever and this lever are sprung loaded. This is the second spring. It goes behind the B lever and it goes on this post. There's a groove around that post that spring seats into. And it's not seated there yet. With that in position, normally I hold back this tab, move the blade actuating ring forward so that the blades are fully open. Then I can swing the B lever into position. Now the notch in the back of the B lever needs to pick up that spring. That spring's not sitting at a suitable height for me to achieve that. And position the B lever onto its post, like that. This spring and screw that holds the B lever in place can go in, and I had to straighten that spring, it was a bit bent out of shape. This is awkward to get into position because the spring is pushing the screw away from where I need the screw to be. Right, finally. Put that screw down, make sure the B lever moves freely, nip that screw up tight, and the spring here I need to swing right round to here, like that. That's acting against this lever here now. Alright, if I hold back the B lever, I'll lift that with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. At that point I'm going to put a little touch of molybdenum paste in 3 areas. One is on the detent here, the detent spring on the blade actuating ring. And 2 points on the blade actuating ring here, and directly opposite here where the main cam picks up the blade actuating ring. Okay, that part, so far so good, that went smoothly enough. Now let's get the pallet wheel in place, and there's a sector gear here on the arm that drives the pallet wheel. I'm going to put a wipe of molybdenum paste on the catch at the end there. These parts were unusually clean and shiny, which means somebody cleaned them very thoroughly indeed, to the extent that there was no lubrication of any sort on them. Now it's widely said that shutters don't need any oil. That's just quite true. Some people take that to mean that shutters don't need any lubrication, which is quite false. So don't mistake oil for lubrication. Oil can be lubrication. Lubrication doesn't necessarily have to be oil. Alright, that moves smoothly enough. Now the setting lever for the flash sync speed and self timer I need to put in place. Now there's a detent here in the case. I'm going to rub some molybdenum paste on there. It only needs a touch. The setting lever here has a little ratchet sort of piece on it here, little ratchet teeth. I usually give that a wipe with a bit of molybdenum paste and put this in place. The pin needs to go behind that spring, the one that on the screw that held the B lever in place. So you've got to fit that pin down in there, sometimes it wants to catch on the pin instead of going behind it, so you pull the spring back, allow the pin to come up through it. That's good. The shim only goes on one way. There's a little notch in the body that that tab sits into, and the lever that sets the aperture. I'll put that in place. Now I suspect that this might be a bit distorted because it didn't want to move earlier, but I may be wrong on that score. It may be that it had just popped out of place. So I'll put it on and see if I can get this. Hang on, that spring has just, I've lifted that shaft up and allowed the spring to pop around the back where I don't want it. That's better. Put this on there. I've got 3 screws, one of which I've managed to drop. I can see it, it's alright. One last one over here. Swing this round where you can vaguely see it. Tighten that. That one. And this one, and check to see if that moves. Yeah, look, that's moving absolutely freely. There's no problem there at all. So I don't know what I'd done earlier, but I suspect I just managed to lift this arm up over the top of the post where it connects to the diaphragm. Possibly, or somebody else had when they put it together. But the main thing is it moves, and it moves freely. The flash sink stuff. Let's get all this in place. Just put a wipe of molybdenum paste through that. It goes over here. This spring pushes against the inside of the case. You have to sort of hook this into place, get it over its post, and it seats underneath this tab here. The spring should be about halfway up the wall, and that looks good to me. Here's the moving flash contact. I managed to stay on the camera, only just. Right. Here's the moving flash contact. That sits on the top there. Let's get that positioned. Okay, that's sitting where it should be. If I cock this, that moves the flash contact across, and I can get this cover in place with the arm on it, seat that correctly. I'll put these pointy tweezers away before I do myself another serious injury. Now, a little plain screw at this end. At the other end there's a return spring and a shoulder screw. You need to be cautious that the spring doesn't get trapped underneath the screw. That's free to revolve around the shoulder. Otherwise it won't work properly. Just check that that moves, that's good. Tighten those two screws up. The spring needs to be lifted up and hook into a spot at the back of that arm, so that that arm is now sprung loaded. And the shutter release lever can go in. Now the shutter release lever goes in here, and this tab needs to hook underneath the B lever. The spring needs to be brought round and tuck inside inside the case. It should slide down inside the case. Sometimes you need to give it a bit of encouragement. So there's the shutter release in place. It's all going fairly smoothly. Must be a hiccup here somewhere. The main cam and its spring. Now these are just unnaturally free from lubrication. How this worked at all, I'm blowed if I know. I haven't cleaned those, that's how they came out of the shutter. So this curved surface needs a wipe of molybdenum paste or graphite grease or something of a similar nature, because otherwise it creates a lot of friction when you are cocking the shutter as that travels across the end of the retard gear train, and that loads up the shutter cocking rack, and you don't want to load up the shutter cocking rack because they're fairly fragile. Okay, well I've just misplaced my spring. There it is. All is good. The spring's in good order. Normally these are copiously lubricated with graphite grease when you see them. I'm just going to give it a wipe with some molybdenum paste around the inside. That has to hook into the main cam. There's a little hole in the main cam that the end of the spring drops into, and this end of the spring needs to be lifted up and over and hooks in to this bracket here. So the shutter is basically ready to go at this stage. If I cock it, press the release, you can see it goes. Now this arm here, I'm going to run some molybdenum paste down that arm. That's so that as the main cam comes around, it runs over it smoothly. That shutter's functional now, but it needs the speed trains, the self-timer and the retard gear train. So I'll clean those and put them in place.